The telephone rang at 4:47 a.m. on September 30th, 1955. Dean Martin was already awake, sitting in his living room in Brentwood, nursing a cup of black coffee and staring at nothing in particular. He'd been having trouble sleeping lately. Something had been gnawing at him for weeks, a feeling he couldn't shake, like a melody stuck in his head that he couldn't quite place. When the phone rang at that ungodly hour, he knew. Before he picked it up, before he heard the trembling voice of his agent on the other end, before the words James Dean and car accident and dead tumbled out in a jumbled, impossible sentence, he knew. His hand shook as he reached for the receiver. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with unspoken dread. "Dean, it's Jack. I'm sorry to call so early, but there's been an accident. James Dean, he's gone." Dean Martin didn't say anything. He couldn't. The coffee cup slipped from his other hand and shattered on the hardwood floor, brown liquid spreading across the polished surface like blood. But Dean didn't notice. He was somewhere else. Somewhere 6 weeks earlier, in a crowded commissary at Warner Bros., watching a kid with slicked back hair and restless eyes walk toward him with a question that would haunt Dean Martin for the rest of his life. To understand what happened between Dean Martin and James Dean, two men who shared a first name and not much else, you have to understand Hollywood in the summer of 1955. It was a city, an industry, and a culture caught between two worlds. The old Hollywood was dying. The studio system that had created gods and goddesses out of ordinary people was crumbling. Television was stealing audiences. The Hays Code was starting to crack. And a new generation of actors was emerging, young, hungry, and dangerous. They didn't want to be movie stars. They wanted to be artists. James Dean was their prophet. At 24 years old, Dean had already filmed 2 movies that would change cinema forever: East of Eden and Rebel Without a Cause. He was the embodiment of everything the old guard didn't understand: method acting, psychological realism, raw vulnerability. He mumbled. He slouched. He cried on camera. He made traditional leading men look like wind-up toys. Dean Martin, at 38, was everything James Dean wasn't. He was smooth where James was rough. He was controlled where James was chaotic. Dean Martin had spent 15 years learning how to make everything look easy. The singing, the jokes, the charm. It was all carefully constructed. A beautiful illusion. Dean Martin knew exactly who he was supposed to be. James Dean was still trying to figure it out. The two men existed in different orbits. Dean Martin was a Paramount man, working on comedy films with Jerry Lewis, and beginning to establish himself as a solo act. James Dean was at Warner Bros., the studio of serious drama and social commentary. They ran in different circles. They had different friends. Under normal circumstances, they probably would never have met. But then came August 15th, 1955, and a chance encounter that would connect them forever. Dean Martin was at Warner Bros. That Monday afternoon for a meeting about a potential dramatic role. It was unusual for him to be on that lot. He was trying to shed his comedy image, prove he could do serious work. His agent had set up a lunch with Jack Warner and a director whose name Dean has already forgotten. The meeting had been a disaster. Warner had spent the entire lunch trying to convince Dean to do another comedy, maybe team him up with some other funny guy, since the Jerry Lewis partnership was getting rocky. Dean had smiled, nodded, and felt his dreams of being taken seriously as an actor crumble into his Cobb salad. He was in a foul mood when he walked into the Warner Bros. Commissary at 2:30 p.m., just wanting a cup of coffee and a cigarette before his driver took him back to reality. The lunch rush was over, and the huge cafeteria-style room was mostly empty. A few grips sat in one corner playing cards. A couple of secretaries whispered over dessert in another. And at a table by the window, alone, sat James Dean. Dean Martin recognized him immediately. Everyone in Hollywood knew that face by now. The press had been going crazy over East of Eden, and Rebel was generating buzz before it even came out. The kid was on the cover of every magazine. He was the future, they said. The next Brando, but prettier, more dangerous. James Dean was wearing blue jeans, actual blue jeans in the Warner Bros. Commissary, and a white t-shirt with a pack of cigarettes rolled up in the sleeve. His hair was tousled, and he had a script open in front of him, but he wasn't reading it. He was staring out the window at something Dean couldn't see, his jaw working rhythmically on a piece of gum. Dean Martin got his coffee from the counter. He was going to walk right past the kid's table, mind his own business, and get the hell out of this studio where nobody wanted what he was selling. But as he passed, James Dean looked up. Their eyes met, and something in that look, a recognition maybe, or a question, made Dean Martin stop. "You're Dean Martin," James Dean said. It wasn't a question. "And you're James Dean." Dean replied with a slight smile. "We've got that in common at least." James Dean didn't smile back. He studied Dean with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable, like he was trying to see through the tuxedo and the hair oil to something underneath. "You want to sit down?" Dean Martin glanced at his watch, then at the empty commissary, then back at those strange, searching eyes. Sure, kid, why not? He sat down across from James Dean, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Dean lit a cigarette. James went back to staring out the window. The silence wasn't awkward, exactly. It was more like a standoff, two gunslingers waiting to see who would draw first. Finally, James spoke. I've seen your movies.
Yeah, which ones?
Most of them, the ones with Jerry Lewis. Dean waited for the punchline, the criticism. Everyone had an opinion about the Martin and Lewis pictures. Lowbrow, juvenile, not real cinema. But James Dean just nodded. You're good, real good. People don't see it because of all the he gestured vaguely. All the noise, the comedy, but you're good. Dean Martin was caught off guard. Thanks, I'm trying to do more dramatic work. That's why I was here today, actually. How'd it go? They want me to be funny. Yeah, James Dean said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. They always want you to be what they need, not what you are. Dean Martin took a long drag on his cigarette, studying the kid across from him. Up close, James Dean looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hands, when he reached for his own cigarette, trembled slightly. He had the look of someone running on fumes, burning too bright, too fast. You okay, kid? Dean asked. James Dean laughed, but there was no humor in it. Why does everyone keep asking me that? Because you look like you haven't slept in a week. I haven't, can't turn it off. James tapped his temple. The character. Once I'm in it, I can't get out. It's like I'm living in two places at once. Here, and wherever he is. You're talking about method acting. I'm talking about the truth, James Dean said, his voice sharp. When I'm doing a scene, it has to be real. It has to hurt. Otherwise, what's the point? If I'm just pretending, if I'm just putting on a mask, he looked directly at Dean Martin, then I'm just you. It should have been an insult. But Dean heard something else in it. A question. Maybe even an accusation. How do you do it? How do you put on the mask every day and not lose yourself? Dean Martin stubbed out his cigarette. You think I'm pretending? Aren't you? Kid, everyone in this town is pretending. The difference is, some of us know the difference between the performance and the person. You're trying to erase that line, and that's dangerous. James Dean leaned forward, his eyes intense. That's what makes it real. No, Dean said quietly. That's what makes you crazy. For a moment, James Dean looked like he might argue. But then something in his expression shifted. A crack in the armor, a glimpse of the scared kid underneath the rebel pose. How do you do it? He asked, and his voice was suddenly younger, more vulnerable. How do you make it last? And there it was. The question Dean Martin would hear in his nightmares for the next 40 years. Dean Martin sat back in his chair, considering the young man across from him. He'd been in this business for 15 years. He'd seen plenty of shooting stars, kids who burned bright and flamed out, leaving nothing but headlines and heartbreak. James Dean had that look, the look of someone determined to go supernova. You want the truth? Dean asked. Always. You make it last by not trying to die for it. You make it last by remembering that this, he gestured around the commissary, the studio, the whole glittering machinery of Hollywood. This is a job, a good job, a lucky job, but a job. You do the work, you cash the check, and then you go home and live your actual life. James Dean shook his head. That's not enough. It's not enough for you, right now, because you're 24, and you think you're going to live forever. Dean leaned forward, his voice low and serious. But here's what nobody tells you, kid. The cameras don't love you because you're suffering. They love you because you're alive. And if you keep using yourself up, keep burning through yourself like fuel. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There won't be anything left. Maybe that's the point, James said softly. Maybe you're supposed to use it all up. Leave nothing on the table. Live fast. Don't. Dean interrupted sharply. Don't finish that sentence. Don't turn your life into a tagline. James Dean smiled, but it was a sad smile. Too late. They sat in silence for a moment. Dean Martin wanted to say more, wanted to grab this kid by the shoulders and shake some sense into him, but he also knew it wouldn't matter. James Dean had already made his choice. He was going to chase the truth, the authenticity, the realness, all the way to whatever end awaited him. I bought a Porsche, James said suddenly. A 55er Spyder, silver. I'm going to race it. Dean Martin felt something cold settle in his stomach. Racing is dangerous. Everything worth doing is dangerous. Not everything worth doing is worth dying for. James Dean looked at him with those intense, haunted eyes. How do you know? Have you ever really risked anything? It was a fair question. Dean Martin had built his career on playing it safe. The comedy act with Jerry Lewis. The smooth persona. The carefully controlled image. He'd never thrown himself into anything the way James Dean threw himself into his roles. He'd never lived on the edge. But he was still here. Still alive. Still working. "I've risked enough," Dean said quietly, "and I plan to be around long enough to see my kids grow up. That's worth more to me than any truth I could find at the bottom of a bottle or at the end of a speedometer." James Dean nodded slowly, but Dean could tell he didn't really understand. How could he? At 24, death is theoretical. It's something that happens to other people. Older people. People who don't have the reflexes, or the luck, or the magic that keeps you invincible. Dean Martin pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card. He scribbled his home phone number on the back. "Look, kid, if you ever need anything, if you ever want to talk, or you need a place to crash, or you just need someone to tell you you're not crazy, you call me. Anytime, I mean it." James Dean took the card, looked at it for a long moment, then slipped it into his jeans pocket. "Why? Because somebody should have done the same for me when I was your age. Because you remind me of," Dean paused, trying to find the right words. "You remind me of what I might have been if I'd been braver, or stupider. I haven't figured out which. Maybe both," James Dean said, and for the first time, he smiled a real smile. Dean Martin stood up. His driver would be waiting. He had to get back to his life, his carefully constructed, perfectly safe life. But he hesitated, looking down at James Dean, wanting to say one more thing, the right thing, the thing that might make a difference. "Slow down, kid," he said finally. "Whatever you're chasing, it'll still be there tomorrow." James Dean looked up at him. "How do you know?" "I don't," Dean admitted. "But you won't be there to find out if you don't slow down." He walked away then, leaving James Dean alone at the table by the window. Dean Martin didn't look back. He walked through the commissary, out into the blazing California sun, and climbed into his car. As his driver pulled away from the Warner Bros. Lot, Dean Martin looked out the window and saw James Dean's Porsche parked in the executive lot. It was silver, beautiful, deadly. Dean Martin had a bad feeling he couldn't shake. The next 6 weeks were a blur for Dean Martin. He was preparing for a new film, dealing with the increasingly bitter dissolution of his partnership with Jerry Lewis, and trying to figure out what his career would look like as a solo act. But every now and then, usually late at night when he couldn't sleep, he'd think about James Dean and that conversation in the commissary. He'd think about the question, how do you make it last? He'd think about the card he'd given the kid with his phone number on it. The phone never rang. Dean told himself that was good. It meant James Dean was fine. It meant he was working, living, racing his cars, being young and reckless and alive. Dean Martin had done his part. He'd offered help. It wasn't his responsibility to chase down every troubled kid in Hollywood, but the bad feeling didn't go away. On September 29th, 1955, Dean Martin went to bed early. He'd had a long day of recording at Capitol Records, and he was exhausted, but he couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, haunted by dreams he couldn't quite remember when he woke up in the darkness at 4:30 a.m. He went downstairs, made coffee, and sat in his living room, waiting for something he couldn't name. When the phone rang 17 minutes later, he wasn't surprised. The funeral was private, but Dean Martin went anyway. He stood in the back, wearing dark glasses and a black suit, and watched as Hollywood buried its future. Natalie Wood was there, weeping. Sal Mineo looked like he'd aged 10 years. Directors, producers, studio executives, they all came to mourn the loss of what might have been. Dean Martin didn't cry. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, remembering a kid in blue jeans, asking him how to make it last. After the service, as everyone filed out, Dean Martin walked to the casket. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, the same brand James Dean had been smoking that day in the commissary. He set them on top of the casket. "Sorry, kid," he whispered. "I should have tried harder." But even as he said it, he knew it wouldn't have mattered. James Dean was always going to end up here. He was always going to burn too bright, too fast, too real. That was who he was. That was the choice he'd made. Dean Martin walked out of the funeral into the Los Angeles sunshine. He climbed into his car and told his driver to take him home. As they drove through the city, Dean looked out the window at all the young kids walking the streets with their slicked back hair and their leather jackets, all of them trying to be James Dean now. They didn't understand. James Dean wasn't someone you could imitate. He was a warning. In the years that followed, Dean Martin became one of the biggest stars in the world. His solo career took off. His television show became a hit. His Las Vegas shows were legendary. He made it last. But sometimes, late at night, when the audience had gone home and the lights were off, and it was just Dean Martin alone with his thoughts, he'd think about that afternoon in the Warner Bros. Commissary. He'd think about the question he couldn't answer, and the warning he'd given that couldn't be heard. He kept the card, the one he'd written his phone number on, in his wallet for years. It became yellowed and creased, but he never threw it away. It was a reminder of the conversation that haunted him, the kid he couldn't save, and the terrible price of authenticity. In 1975, 20 years after James Dean's death, a reporter asked Dean Martin if he had any regrets about his career. Dean Martin smiled that easy smile and said no. But that night, he went home and looked at a photograph of James Dean that hung in his study, one of the few personal mementos he kept from the old Hollywood days. In the picture, James Dean was young and beautiful and alive, staring at the camera with those intense, searching eyes. "I tried, kid," Dean Martin said to the photograph. "For what it's worth, I tried." But the kid in the photograph just stared back, forever 24, forever asking the question Dean Martin could never quite answer. How do you make it last? The truth is, you don't. Not the way James Dean wanted to. You can't burn at both ends and expect to see the sunrise. You can't live fast and die young and still be there for the people who love you. You can't chase authenticity all the way to the grave and call it art. Or maybe you can. Maybe James Dean was right. Maybe the only way to be truly real is to risk everything, to hold nothing back, to use yourself up in pursuit of the truth. But Dean Martin knew something James Dean never learned. The truth isn't worth dying for. Love is, family is, being there tomorrow is, and in the end, that's how you make it last. Not by burning brighter, but by burning longer. Not by dying young, but by living well. Not by chasing truth at 110 miles per hour on a California highway, but by waking up every morning and choosing again and again to be here. Dean Martin made it last for 40 more years after that conversation in the Warner Brothers commissary. He saw his children grow up. He performed for millions of people. He made them laugh and cry and forget their troubles for a little while. He lived a full, rich, complicated life. And every year on September 30th, he would raise a glass apple juice, usually because Dean Martin's drunk act was just an act, and toast the kid who taught him the most important lesson of his career. The show must go on. But the show isn't worth dying for. James Dean died at 5:45 p.m. on September 30th, 1955, at the age of 24. His Porsche 550 Spyder collided with another car on California State Route 46. He died almost instantly. He was on his way to a race. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, at the age of 78. He was surrounded by family. He'd lived long enough to see his grandchildren. He'd lived long enough to matter. Both men left legacies. Both men changed Hollywood, but only one of them was there to see it happen. The next time you watch a James Dean movie, or you see a photograph of him leaning against his Porsche with that dangerous smile, remember this: there was a moment when Dean Martin tried to save him. There was a conversation in a cafeteria. There was a warning given and a phone number offered. And remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is slow down. Sometimes the most authentic life is the one that lasts long enough to mean something. Sometimes playing it safe isn't cowardice, it's wisdom. Dean Martin understood that. James Dean never did. And that's the hidden story of the day. Two Deans met at Warner Bros., and one of them asked a question the other couldn't answer. This is Dean Martin, the hidden story. We don't just tell you about the tuxedos and the spotlight. We reveal the moments Hollywood kept hidden, the conversations in empty commissaries, the warnings that went unheeded, and the regrets that lasted a lifetime. If this story moved you, if you've ever asked yourself how to make it last, leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in our next video, we're uncovering the night Dean Martin stopped his show for a crying waitress, and what he whispered in her ear changed everything. Until then, remember, it's not about how bright you burn, it's about how long you shine. Keep swinging, Pally, and please, slow down.